Welcome to the Alyn podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Dr. Judson Brewer. Dr. Brewer has over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training and a career in scientific research. He's, a, he's passionate about understanding how our brains work and how to use that knowledge to help people make deep, permanent changes in their life. And today we will be speaking about his latest book, Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycle of worry and fear to heal your mind. Dr. Brewer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I'm feeling quite anxious, but your book is making me at ease. And this is something that, of course, as we are winding down the coronavirus, a lot of people have been going through. So I think your book is quite timely. And in your book, you speak a lot about the beginning of your career, how you were feeling anxious as well. So I wonder if you could share a little bit of your background with our listeners. How tell us about that time that you were feeling anxious and you wanted to know where the bathroom were at all time.
Yes. At the end of college, I didn't even know that I had anxiety. I thought I had an intestinal, a bacterial infection in my intestine. But it was really my anxiety showing up via GI. Let's just put it some distress in my GI tract. My GI tract was letting me know that something was a little out of whack. So, it was in medical school that I started to make the connection between stress and anxiety and how my mind worked. And I even did my Ph.D. research looking at the molecular mechanisms of why stress affects the immune system. In residency, as I finished my MD PhD program and then decided to do a career in psychiatry, a lot of it based on what I learned about my own mind and how little we use this, some of the basic understanding of how our minds work to help people with addictions and habits and even anxiety. In residency, as I was training to become a psychiatrist, I started getting panic attacks, in residency. And I was at that time, I had been meditating. I started meditating at the beginning of medical school, but I had been meditating for about 10 years at that point and realized that mindfulness really helped me with my own panic attacks. So that was, I stored that away. And then as I launched my career as an addiction psychiatrist and as a neuroscientist, started studying habit change and mindfulness training for addictions, for example. And so my lab, we did a clinical study with mindfulness training for smoking, for example. We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. We even were one of the first labs to start developing and testing app-based mindfulness training programs to see if we could package evidence-based treatment into an app and deliver it that way. For example, we developed an app called Eat Right Now and found that we got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating. And that was where I really started shifting into looking at anxiety, from my own personal experience, whether it was, feeling anxious and having that affect my mind-body interaction to my full-blown panic attacks. I remember somebody in our Eat Right Now program asking if I could make a program for anxiety because she was seeing that anxiety was triggering her to stress eat. Yet I was thinking, well, I generally prescribe medications for anxiety, but that put a bug in my ear. And I went back and looked at the literature. And it turns out that back in the 1980s, people were suggesting that anxiety could be driven like any other habit. And so we developed this Unwinding Anxiety app and did some clinical studies where we've got a 57% reduction in anxiety in anxious physicians. We got a 67% reduction in anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder. And all of that came together with my own mindfulness practice to see, this is how our brain works. We can actually develop evidence-based treatments based on these basic mechanisms and have really good clinical effects.
Okay, and is that something common that if you are feeling anxious for your body to manifest that anxieties, for example, in your case, you were anxious about knowing where the toilets are and you had to go to the toilets quite often, and that's how it manifested on you, and of course in many other people it manifests in many other ways, but I just don't see how the relationship between you feeling anxious about something, let's say my girlfriend being upset at me, and my body reacting in a particular way.
Yes, it's a really good question. I don't know the specific prevalence of what's called irritable bowel syndrome or IBS, but that's how my anxiety was showing up. So for some people, like for me, anxiety was showing up as a specific syndrome, this irritable bowel syndrome, which really highlights this interaction between the mind and the body. I would say for everyone, anxiety, the definition of anxiety is really this feeling of nervousness or worry or unease about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. And so regardless of whether it shows up in our GI tract or our guts, I think we all know what it feels like to have this restless, uncertain, nervous feeling in our bodies.
And what are some other ways in which anxiety will manifest itself in our bodies?
Well, I think, for a lot of people, and I'm just thinking of my own experience as well, there's this spectrum where there can be a feeling where there's a tightness, there's a tension. I tend to feel it in my shoulders and in my back. Some people describe feeling it in their jaw, where their jaw is a little tense, or even their eyes are a little more narrowed and tensed up. And so I would say it really can show up as a tension, but it can show up in different ways in different parts of the body. And it tends to be in the core, like in the solar plexus area, in the chest area, in the shoulders. In fact, there was a study published in 2014 where this group took something like 800 individuals and they induced anxiety in them. And they had them map out where they felt it in their body. And the most common place that people described feeling it was actually in their chest region.
Wow. And how common is it? I mean, at this time, you were quite young, you're going to college. It seems to me that at that age, we don't have many anxieties, unless the one that comes to mind is maybe financial anxiety, or maybe an anxiety right before taking an exam or something like that. So how common is it for a young person to feel anxious?
It's increasingly common. I'm trying to remember, there was a study that was published maybe a year or two ago. This was even before coronavirus, BC. It seems like ancient history. And I think this report had found that it was more than 50% of college students reported moderate to severe anxiety. And I don't know if that's an increased level from when I was in college, when, now, there's a lot of uncertainty around just getting a job, where that might have been different, 20 or 25 years ago. So I think some of the circumstances have changed. Plus, we also have circumstances that we know increase anxiety, such as social media, which were, it was internet, was not, had not been invented when I graduated from college. It was just starting, actually, it was just starting to bloom right in the late 90s, if I remember correctly.
Wow. In regards to the symptoms, I don't know how relevant this is, but um, 3 years ago, I underreported my income. And a few weeks ago, I got a letter from the government saying, hey, we noticed some discrepancies between the income that you reported and our records here. And right away, I felt huge anxiety. I say, "Oh my God, I got caught!" So I couldn't sleep for about 3 days. Finally, I kind of made some worst case scenarios. And I feel better, whatever. But I wonder if this is one more of the symptoms, not being able to sleep.
Absolutely. So worry and anxiety have huge effects on sleep, to the point where the National Institutes of Health in the United States, they came up with this huge list of standardized questions that they ask researchers in particular to use when they're doing studies. And they even came up with a bank of questions, a list of questions that specifically relate worry to sleep. And in fact, my lab just finished a study where we were looking at whether addressing anxiety and worry could actually help people sleep. And in a randomized controlled trial of our Unwinding Anxiety app, we indeed found that that was the case. Treating people's anxiety could specifically improve their sleep, especially if they had worry-related sleep problems. So I'm glad you bring that forward. I think that's very, very common.
That's how it manifested on me. Okay, so you mentioned twice already meditation or meditating as a tool to combat anxiety, but a lot of I don't know how many people, but I have heard from here and there that meditation is like a woo-woo science, and it's something like yogi and hippie do. So I wonder, I mean, I have heard that many times. So I wonder if you could address that critique.
Yes, well, I think there are these ideas around, it's about gazing at candles or smelling incense or, holding crystals. And I don't know how much science there is into, incense and crystals, but I do know that there's a huge amount of science around the mind. And so if somebody says, oh, that's just woo-woo, I say, well, I'm a scientist. Let's study it and see how well it works. And in fact, over and over, we've been able to show that mindfulness training can help. We get 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. And so I don't know, nobody comes up after I present those studies and says, oh, that's woo-woo. These are randomized controlled trials. In fact, we've even looked at the brain mechanisms where we've been able to pinpoint the brain networks that change with mindfulness training, even with app-based mindfulness training. And in there, we can predict clinical outcomes based on how much these brain regions change. And we publish all of these in, highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. So, if somebody says that's woo, I would say, read the literature. This is science, pure and simple.
Okay. At one time in history, we were hunter-gatherers. We were hungry. We would get some berries. We would hunt a buffalo or something. And it seems to me, at that time, we didn't have anxiety. So at what time in history did we become anxious?
That is a really good question. So I don't know if anybody can pinpoint an exact time. Yet I would say it probably relates to sometime when our prefrontal cortex started developing. So you can think of, the hunter-gatherer brain is the oldest part of the brain, and it helps us survive through finding food and remembering where it is, and also finding danger and remembering where it is. So we can go back to the food and we can avoid the danger. Yet you can think of the newer parts of our brain, literally the neocortex, the new brain, is layered on top, and it helps us survive in different ways, which is through thinking and planning. And the way it helps us survive is it takes previous scenarios, like it takes information from things that we've done in the past, and it projects that into the future. It makes projections or scenarios and says, oh, based on this, maybe this is what's going to happen. So we can try to predict the future. So it's when those parts of the brain came online, when the neocortex developed, that's probably when anxiety, or the first hints of anxiety, came, because that part of the brain could then start spinning out into all these worst case scenarios, kind of like you described, when you were describing your income thing, where it's like, my brain had to think of all these worst case scenarios. So your brain could be thinking and planning for the future, saying, okay, I need to square this with the government or whatever. That's not anxiety. That's just thinking and planning. But if it starts thinking, oh no, this could happen, or this could happen, or this could happen, that's based on not having accurate information. Remember, anxiety is about, this feeling of worry about something with an uncertain outcome, right? So you don't know what's going to happen, and your brain starts spinning out of control, thinking, oh no, oh no, oh no. So it's probably emerged sometime after that part of the brain developed.
Okay, so yeah, our ancestor hunter and gatherer, you don't know the exact day that they began to get anxious, but do you know when it became something that began to be mentioned in the medical records? When scientists, doctors, therapists began to notice this thing called anxiety and recorded and prescribed it and treated?
Well, historically, and I'm not a historian, so others could probably answer this better than I could, but historically, there are all sorts of descriptions of basically nervousness, people having, this, something happen with their humors, for example, back in the day, in the medieval times, and they would bleed somebody that I imagine was anxious as one of the treatments. In the 1800s, there was and I quoted Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States. I quoted him in my Unwinding Anxiety book because he talked about anxiety, So you certainly has been described in the 1800s, and, as medical science progressed, I think it's been increasingly refined in terms of how people describe what it is.
Okay, it feels to me that sometimes we get stuck in cycles of anxiety. So let's say my mind deals with a particular anxiety. Let's say I got into a fight with my girlfriend and we fix it up, and then my brain finds another things to be anxious about, and it seems like it goes from one cycle to the other, and it's never ending. And then I have a disagreement with my boss, and then whatever I get I park in the incorrect place, and now I'm anxious about getting a ticket.
Yeah. So what you're describing is what got me really interested in looking at anxiety itself, because I used to think it was just this feeling, and I would, I need to prescribe medications for it. And that's all we can do. It's this feeling, and hope that a medication works. And by hoping that a medication works, I can tell you there's a number called this number needed to treat, which is, it gives us a quick and dirty, or a simple estimate of how well the treatment works. And so the higher number, the worse it is. So for medications, for our best medications out there, the number needed to treat is 5.2, which means that if I'm prescribing medications for patients, for the next 5 patients that I prescribe a medication to, only one of them is going to show a significant reduction in symptoms. And I don't know which one that's going to be at this point. At this point in time, that's as good as our science is. So I'm basically playing the medication lottery in, trying to guess who's going to benefit from anxiety. And so I was getting anxious in terms of how am I going to help my patients, not only not knowing which one's going to benefit, but what am I going to do with the other 80%? And so this is where I was really looking at this, anxiety as a habit, and how, just like you're describing, how is this actually driven to the point where, we develop worrying as a habitual behavior, to the point where it's like our brains are just looking for something to worry about. It can be that strong. And I see this in my clinic, where some of my patients, they're just constantly worrying, and it doesn't matter what it is, they're just going to worry about it no matter what. This highlights how it's our old survival brain kind of picking up on the substrate of worry, where, anxiety. So actually it only takes 3 elements to create any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So, the trigger, behavior, result. Yeah. So the only thing that our brain needs, and this is set up to help us remember where food is. So, You know, imagine our ancient ancestors out on the savannah. They're foraging for food. They see some food, there's the trigger. They eat the food, there's some behavior, and assuming that it's not poisonous, their stomach sends this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it, okay? So anxiety can be driven in the same way. Anxiety is that trigger, so the feeling of nervousness or unease, then triggers a mental behavior of worrying. We start to worry, oh no, oh no, oh no. And then the result is that we feel like we're a little more in control because at least we're doing something by worrying. And that result gives us enough of a reward that it feeds back so that the next time we feel anxious, we start worrying again. And that's what creates the habit of worrying to the point where some of us, we are just constantly worrying.
Okay. So I don't know how much your consultation costs, but for my listeners, can you tell them how to break that habit of worrying, how to get off that habit, and then how long does it take to change a habit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So and that's actually the basis for me writing this book, was so that anybody can learn how to unwind their own anxiety. So I split it into 3 steps. In the book, it goes into this a lot more, but basically, first we've got to map out these habit loops. So just like I described, if we don't know how our minds work, we can't possibly work with them. So the first step is just to map it out. What's the trigger? What's the behavior? And the behavior tends to come in some flavor of worry. But we can also have other habits where when we're anxious, we stress eat, or we drink too much alcohol, or we go on social media too much, or we binge watch Netflix. So we can map out that behavior, and then we can see what the result is. That's actually just the first step, is mapping this process out. The second step is tapping into the reward-based learning systems in our brain. And the way to do this is to know that the only way to change a habit is to change its reward value. So for example, when I work with people who want to quit smoking, I have them pay attention as they smoke, and they start to realize that cigarettes taste like crap. And so what that does is it drops that reward value in their brain. Their brain has kind of laid down a certain reward value, and they update that reward value by bringing awareness to the smoking. That reward value drops, which makes them less excited. Let's say they become disenchanted with smoking. That makes it easier to stop smoking because they're less excited to do it in the future. We can do the same thing with anxiety. So as we start to worry, we can ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? Is this solving the problem? No. Is it keeping my family safe? No. Is it doing whatever my brain thinks it's supposed to be doing? I can almost promise you, worry does not help anything. It uses a lot of energy. It makes it harder for us to think and plan. And in fact, it raises our blood pressure, so even has physiologic consequences. So that's the second step, is to really ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? So we can see the results of the behavior. Now, you can just remember this as looking at the cause and effect relationship. That's how all habits are formed. The behavior has some effect. If the effect is rewarding, we're going to repeat it. If the effect is not rewarding, we're going to be less likely to repeat it. And that's that reward value piece dropping as we pay attention. So with that second step, as the reward value of worrying decreases, we can move into the third step. And I think of this as bringing in the bigger, better offer, the BBO. So if our brain is looking for things that are rewarding, we can help our brain see, one, that worrying is not rewarding, and then give it something better. And here, I love I think of these as 2 categories. One is curiosity and one is kindness. So for example, if we're feeling anxious, instead of worrying, oh no, why am I anxious, and trying to solve that problem, we can shift into a curiosity mode and go, oh, here's anxiety. What does this feel like in my body? Where do I feel it? What is it made up of? What are the component elements? Is it tightness? Is it tension? Is it burning? And we can start to see that this feeling comes and goes on its own. We don't have to do anything beyond being curious about it. So that's one category, is bringing curiosity in. Curiosity feels better than anxiety. And so our brain's naturally going to move toward it the more we practice being curious. The other category is kindness. When we judge ourselves, like, oh, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get control of myself? Why can't I stop worrying? We can start to notice, what does that feel like? Oh, when we beat ourselves up, it doesn't feel very good. Well, what's it feel like when we bring some kindness to ourselves? That to our brain also feels better. So if it's anxiety, we can compare that to curiosity. We can bring in that bigger, better offer of curiosity when we're anxious. If it's self-judgment, we can notice what that feels like, and we can bring in that bigger, better offer of kindness. And between those two categories, it covers a lot of territory. And I give people a bunch of specific practices that they can do in the Unwinding Anxiety book to bring in those bigger, better offers.
Wow. Okay, so how how will you deal with what I call the pink elephant syndrome, which is when I tell my brain, don't think about the pink elephant, and my brain continues going back to the pink elephant. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I find it not so easy to tell my brain what to think about. My brain thinks what is think is important to think about at that moment, and sometimes I feel like I have no control. I mean, I'm saying me, but I mean
Well,
us.
you're describing what most people experience, if not everyone. And this pink elephant piece highlights how little our thinking brain has control. So, this is highlights one of the fallacies of willpower, that, oh, if we should just use our willpower to stop worrying. And as you're highlighting, the more we try to stop something, the more it's going to stick around. There's this saying that I really like: what we resist persists. Okay. So here it highlights how, using willpower is not going to help us fix anxiety. But there's a second part of that saying. So what we resist persists. If we try to not think about the pink elephant, we try to not worry, it's just going to stick around longer. What we resist persists. What we feel heals. And so here, if we just bring awareness and bring curiosity in, we can allow those sensations to come and go. And instead of trying to push against them or fix them somehow, we can let them take their course. And in the process, we start to develop that bigger, better offer of being curious, where curiosity is not about resisting at all. And so ironically, the more curious we are, the more these feelings will pass on their own without sticking around, because we haven't been resisting them.
Well, I tell you, that did work for me. Okay, so I'm not going to keep you any longer. I think you help my listeners enough. And if they want more help, they can get your book. So can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where they can follow you?
Sure. The book is called Unwinding Anxiety, and they can find it anywhere books are sold. I also have a website, drjudd.com, that has a bunch of free resources, as well as links to where people can buy the book. And the website's just drjud.com.
The links will be in the show notes. Dr. Judd, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.